Astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
What's going on, everyone? It's Jaronism, back with another video for you today. I'll admit, I had high hopes for Trump. I felt like maybe he was the answer, that maybe he bucked the system, and F you to the cabal. But then came his cabinet selections, and all their connections, and I started to have my doubts. And then came his Zionist connections, especially with Kushner as his top aide, and I was almost done. Then, in research for this video, all hope was lost. So in this video, I have compiled evidence and clips which will be eye-opening to say the very least. Statements by Trump and others about 9/11, about George Bush, about Adnan Khashoggi, World Trade Center towers, and that piece of crap Zionist scumbag who got rich off 9/11, Larry Silverstein. Lots going on, lots of clips. I'll pop in from time to time with a comment, but whether you think 9/11 was an inside job or not, and whether you think Trump is the anti-establishment savior come to save us or just another puppet on a string, and whether you think Larry Silverstein is a nice old man or a demon who eats babies, well, by the end of this video, it will all be very clear. 9/11 was a made-for-TV news media fraud. George Bush is a liar, and a terrible one at that, and Trump is and has been just another pawn in the game. And now, Israel has inside knowledge whenever they want it, thanks to Jared Kushner. And Jared's good buddy, fellow Zionist demon Larry Silverstein, knew exactly what was going on and knew exactly when it was going to happen. So let's start off with a short clip for all those science fans out there who still think 9/11 was exactly as presented. Well, maybe Carl Sagan's first wife and scientist Lynn Margulis can help me get through to you guys. Maybe it takes a scientist who questions something for you to allow yourself to question it as well. So here's Lynn. You might know her as Carl Sagan's first wife. Unfortunately, she is no longer with us. She died in November of 2011. And Kevin Barrett of PressTV.ir said, even more tragically, the most prestigious scientist ever to take up the cause of 9/11 truth, Lynn Margulis, died of a stroke 11/22/11. When I last spoke to Lynn, less than a year before her death, she told me she did not want to speak publicly about 9/11 anymore because politics is too dangerous. She sounded scared, like someone had warned or threatened her. Kevin Barrett. Alright, here's the clip. Remember, this is a scientist telling you guys about 9/11.
I teach at the University of Massachusetts. I have a PhD in genetics, but I really do much more geological things these days. 3 buildings come down at almost the speed of free fall, which is the gravitational speed, and for 2 of them it's because airplanes hit them, and for the 3rd one it's a mysterious reason. That is, there's no really coherent hypothesis except it's claimed that there are these fires in them. Now, the most obvious hypothesis for anyone looking at the films, and that was a lot of people, is that the buildings came down because there was very carefully controlled demolition with high explosives that had been planted many weeks, if not months, before. The first thing they do is ignore, in all cases, the most obvious and reasonable hypothesis that is consistent with all other destructions in a very short time of buildings. And what is worse is that all of the evidence was removed. You can't do science without evidence. Very quickly, if this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime, evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. Well, if evidence is removed, no scientist can possibly reconstruct what happened. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned, this is not science. So the claim is that it's something else. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas. So we're not doing science here. We're not doing bad science. We're just not doing science at all, is my claim. But to me is most impressive, since I do microscopic work all the time, are the many, many microscopic samples that show these extremely, totally unique red-gray crystals, red and gray in the same crystal, and it was found in all the dust samples. On the other hand, give an argument that's patently false, that no scientist will accept, that fires, office fires, can bring buildings down at the speed roughly of gravity, of free fall. Number one probably of crime investigation is to collect at the scene of the crime as much evidence as possible for what happened. And you had these steel columns in nice even pieces, and they were whisked away, and evidence was destroyed or removed systematically, extremely close to the time that the crime had occurred. This is not only unscientific, it's illegal. So clearly, if you have to lie or deny or ignore evidence, you are not doing science at all. What you're doing is lying, basically. So this is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence. It doesn't fit their preconceived notions. So they ignore the real result, and they misrepresent and provide evidence from authority that their computer model is right. Well, people do this every day, and they call it science. And the people who do it call themselves scientists. I claim they're not doing science at all. They're doing propaganda or publicity or whatever they're doing, but it's not science. It's not playing by the rules of science.
So, thank you very much, Lynn. I hope that that will at least wake up one person to 9/11 truth. Up next, we take a close look at the Zionist, opportunist, lowlife extraordinaire, Larry Silverstein. Here he is with his wife, Kevin.
It's Clara.
Oh, sorry, his wife, Calvin.
No. Clara.
Oh, Larry and his wife, Carson.
No, it's Clara.
Caden?
Clara.
Kurt.
Clara.
Keenan.
Clara.
Kenny. Kane. Chris.
Clara.
Clara?
Yep.
Oh. Okay, Clara. That's a weird guy's name. Anyway, first let's listen to Larry tell us about the building plans for World Trade Center 7 from the year 2000. Huh?
The building is going to contain not 2 million feet, but 1.7 million. And that's one of the sacrifices we have to make. I said, let's make it and let's get on with it. And so, next thing you know, we've got the designs of a building. And the first design meeting was in April of 2000.
April of 2000. He's having a design meeting in April of 2000 for a building that will come down a year and a half later due to random terrorism. Yeah, sure. Listen to this piece of work tell you about his day on September 11th, 2001.
And construction began shortly thereafter in 2002 on the morning of 9/11. I'm getting ready, getting dressed to go to the dermatologist. I have light-colored hair, light skin. The sun is a disaster for me. I can't take the sun. So, every 3 months, I went to the dermatologist like clockwork. I had to. And that morning, I said to Clara, I said, sweetheart, I've got so much work to do down at the Trade Center. Cancel the dermatologist. I'm going down. And she said, you can't cancel again. You canceled last time. You cannot cancel again. And she got angry.
Didn't he just say that he went every 3 months like clockwork, and then in the very next sentence he tells us he missed his appointment 3 months ago? Like clockwork.
Now, when you're married to somebody for 50 years, and they get upset, and they get angry, and they start screaming, the world comes to an end. And I said, okay, I'm sorry. The words are yes, dear. Whatever you want, I'll do. Don't get angry. Please don't get angry. She said, okay, but you're going to the dermatologist, you're going this morning, and you're not going downtown. Wow. Suddenly, the phone rings. It's the captain of our boat, docked at Chelsea Piers, not far from where we live and not far from the Trade Center. And he said, Mrs. Silverstein, is everything okay with Mr. Silverstein? She said, of course. Why? He said, turn on your television set. And that's when we saw the North Tower in flames. And we saw the plane circling around before it slammed into the South Tower and caused it to end up in flames. And therein was the day of the disaster of 9/11. Changed our lives, changed the lives of everybody in our world, changed the lives of everybody in the world, certainly civilized people, no matter where they live around the globe. And so we lost almost 3,000 people. It was a miracle. My life wasn't lost because she kept me from going down to the Trade Center. She said, you've got to go to the dermatologist. By the way, I never made it to the dermatologist that day, but at least my intentions were right.
Oh yeah, that was a miracle, all right. Lots of miracles happened that day. How about Silverstein's kids, both his son and daughter? They're a miracle. How about the fact that aluminum went through steel and concrete, like butter? Just another miracle. Like the unbelievable insider trading that was done just days leading up to 9/11. How about the miracle of the passport floating down from the sky above and landing on a nearby street? How about the miracle of a $2.3 trillion loss announced by Donald Rumsfeld the day before the World Trade Centers were attacked? How about the miracle that is George Bush seeing the first plane hit the first tower, since nobody saw that until much, much later? I mean, if there's anything good that came out of all this, it's definitely that at the very least, we know that Larry Silverstein's intentions were right, even if he never made it to the dermatologist. What a great man, a great lucky man. Or, I always get those mixed up. Piece of shit. There we go.
I made it to the dermatologist that day, but at least my intentions were right. Of course, I had signed a contract and now own the Trade Center. And I had a lease obligations to pay $120 million a year in ground rent. And I only signed that contract for 99 years. And there I was, 70 years of age. I was a little optimistic. But there I was with an obligation, 99-year obligation to pay the port $120 million a year, forever, seemed like. I had to rebuild, like kind, like quality, and I had an obligation to collect the insurance proceeds from the policies, because that's the only place the money could come from the insurance proceeds. That was my job, my obligation, because they owned the policies. And you could see what happened. You could see the devastation. You could see the obliteration. Everything came down. plus 7 World Trade Center. It wasn't part of the Trade Center, but it was right north of it. And when the antenna came down from the top of the North Tower, it went right through the facade of 7 World Trade Center. Started a fire, and by the end of the afternoon, the building just collapsed. Fortunately, no lives were lost in 7 because there was enough time between when the fire started in that building and the time it collapsed to make sure nobody was left in the building.
Now, Larry spent every single morning on the 107th floor at Windows on the World having breakfast meetings with his new tenants. Remember that Larry had just taken ownership of the building 7 weeks prior to 9/11. Now, Larry the Liar didn't make it to breakfast that morning, as we've heard, and he'll tell again here in a second. And just how lucky is Lucky Larry? Well, 2 of his kids, who were the vice presidents of Silverstein Properties, and went every day with their father to breakfast at Windows on the World, both happened to be running late that day. They didn't live together or anything. They just were in separate incidents, running late, didn't make it, and Dad didn't make it because he had to see a dermatologist.
But we ran into a problem. We couldn't collect the insurance because the insurance companies didn't want to pay. There were 22 insurance companies defending 22 insurers who didn't want to pay their obligations under the policies. And so they took me to court. And I had to beat them in court, the lower court, and then had to take an appeal and win in the upper court. So they owed me $4.5 billion with which to build these buildings. It wasn't enough, but at least it was $4.5 billion. It could start the process. And I couldn't collect. So what do when you beat the insurance companies in court and they still won't pay? A new governor was just elected. Eliot Spitzer, an old friend who I knew well. And I said, Eliot, if you don't help me, I'll never collect from the insurance companies. And guess what? He listened and he said, you know what? You're entitled. I'm going to get you the money. And in 6 months, he got me the $4.5 billion. The insurance companies didn't like me, but at least I got the money. And with the money, we could really start getting into. 7 was done, but now we could start with Tower 4, Tower 3, Tower 2, and Tower 1. And the Mayor Bloomberg, finally looked at this picture and he said, you know, he said, Silverstein, you're entitled to possession of the ground, of the building parcels, because you're paying ground rent to the port and they have an obligation to give you those parcels. And if they don't, then they really have to be criticized. And so there was a major confrontation between the port and ourselves. And all of a sudden, thousands and thousands of workers who want to build these buildings. Each building, takes 10,000 employees to build them. So they started spontaneously demonstrating in front of state offices and government offices, and the next thing you know, we ended up making a deal with the Port Authority. No lives were lost in 7 because there was enough time between when the fire started in that building and the time it collapsed to make sure nobody was left in the building.
So let's listen again as he describes that morning, and remember that he was supposed to be in that building, as were his kids, Roger and Lisa, but everyone was just lucky and had their lives spared. One thing I noticed over and over again in this story is when he gets the call telling him that something's going on at the trade centers, your first thought would be, oh my goodness, my kids. Does he ever mention that? Well, let's see. Let's play a little game. Can you spot the liar? I can.
Where were you on September 11th?
I was home. And the only reason I wasn't where I was every morning, subsequent to the 26th day of July, my mornings were spent usually at a breakfast meeting at Windows, an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting, Windows, the top of it, right? And then going down to visit with my tenants, my new tenants, at the trade center, getting to know them, understanding their problems and so forth, ascertaining how we could service their needs better, which is one of the first things you do when you acquire a property. You begin to meet your tenants and start talking with them. And so my mornings were spent at the trade center, and then by noon I was back uptown. And so that particular morning, because I have light-colored hair and fair skin, and I'm an annuity to the dermatologist, my wife, God bless her, had made an appointment for me at the doctor. And I remember dressing to go to the doctor. I'm finally saying to my wife, I said, sweetheart, I've got so much to do downtown. I got to cancel this. I've got to go downtown. And she said, you're not going to cancel this appointment. You're going to the dermatologist. And, having been married now to the same woman for 46 years, you get this sense of determination on occasion, their voices. And I said, okay, yes, dear, I'll go. I'll go. And then just minutes later, received a telephone call to turn on a television set and witnessed this horrendous circumstance. The first plane hitting, and then the second plane hitting. Of course, with the second hit, it became obvious that this was terrorism.
There you have it. Lucky Larry Silverstein, the man with the four-leaf clover, shoved square up his... Ask yourself the question, what are the chances that, number one, on that day of 9/11/2001, you have an appointment and you don't go to breakfast at the top of the World Trade Center where you spent every other day, and this narrowly saved your life? Add to that, number two, your son, who always attends the breakfast meeting with you, is running late and also narrowly saves his life. Add to that, number three, your daughter, who lives separately from your son and separately from you, who also joins you for breakfast every single morning at 8 o'clock at Windows on the World, the top of the Trade Center. And she is also running late and narrowly saves her life. What if your publicist is supposed to be in an 8 o'clock meeting at the top of the World Trade Center, but he changes the appointment to 9 o'clock and again narrowly saves his life? I mean, how lucky can one guy get? Remember, he also had a planning meeting for the new construction of the World Trade Center Building 7, and they were talking about this in April of 2000, a year and a half before 9/11. That is really, really unbelievable luck. How about you take ownership of those buildings 7 weeks prior, and you make sure to get additional coverage, twice what was already on the building, and make it a cash deal or a cash payout? Man, that's just, luck is on your side. And of course, lastly, you collect on 2 separate insurance claims because you convince the court that each of those occurrences on each respective building actually made them individual actions. So, after a few court cases, Larry won to the tune of $4.5 billion. So, what are the percent chances that one man can be that lucky? Well, I have an idea. It's actually better known as a percentage probability meter. So I'll break it out and let's see what the percent chances are that that happens to that one man. Can somebody be that lucky? And here we go. Begin. All right, it's looking like 0.01. Oh, there's no percent chances. So 0% chances, huh? And you've heard before the whole idea of pull it, right? Well, here's our Larry Silverstein saying to just pull it.
Fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
So around 5:30 or so, they decided to quote-unquote pull it, which means lighting off the detonations which collapse Building 7. Here we have the interview with the reporter that reports Building 7 as having collapsed to the ground and being no longer, yet it's right behind her throughout the window. Let's listen in.
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy. There's almost a sense downtown in New York behind me, down by the World Trade Centers, of just an area completely closed off as the rescue workers try to do their job. But this isn't the first building that has suffered as a result. We know that part of the Marriott Hotel next to the World Trade Center also collapsed as a result of this huge amount of falling debris from 110 floors of the two twin towers of the World Trade Center. As you can see behind me, the Trade Center appears to be still burning. We see these huge clouds of smoke and ash, and we know that behind that there's an empty piece of what was a very familiar New York skyline, a symbol of the financial prosperity of this city, but completely disappeared now, and New York is still unable to take on board what has happened to them today.
I was wondering what it's felt like for you being in Manhattan. Well, unfortunately, I think we've lost the line with Jane Stanley in Manhattan. Perhaps we can rejoin her and follow that up later.
Now, come on, he's got to have some explanation for saying pull it, right? Let's hear his answer.
On a PBS documentary, Real Building America, you made an infamous quote saying, pull it. Now, you later released a press release saying that that was the firefighters outside World Trade Center Building 7 and not 11. It's two questions. If you meant to pull the firefighters out, why didn't you say evacuate the firefighters? And there's also FEMA reports and first responders that I know personally that firefighters were already out that building before you made that statement. So can you please clarify your statement?
The World Trade Center was brought down by a combination of events. The first was the falling antenna from the roof of the North Tower. That antenna came crashing down and sliced through the facade in the front of 7. As it did so, it ruptured fuel lines in the building, which fuel lines were there to serve the emergency generators for the city's, I forget the name of what was the name of the emergency response system. The city here was located at 7 World Trade Center. Nevertheless, that antenna sliced through the fuel lines, caught fire. That fire started to burn and burn intensively. That fire seemed to burn through the rest of the day. By, I forget what time it was, must have been around 3:30, 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon. Clearly, that building was on its way down. And I remember receiving a call from which of the members of the fire department saying that this is a terrible problem and they're not going to be able to contain it. We also had been in touch with our people in the building who told us that all the personnel, all the people who worked in the building, all the personnel in that building had been evacuated. And at that point it became obvious that building was on its way down. And by golly, it was unfortunately the last of the buildings to go down on 9/11. Fortunately, it was the first of the buildings to go back after 9/11, and that's where it is.
Way to avoid the question, you total piece of garbage. Now, you may have seen this before, and if you want to see it employed in a plethora, check out NASA's announcers and the interviews with astronauts. But studies have shown, and many studies have shown, that and signal impending delays in speech. This is attributed sometimes to the fact that liars need time to evaluate their answers to ensure that their lie will be believed. Liars also need additional time to choose the right words to camouflage the truth. Truthful people do not need extra time to convey information in the majority of cases. Truthful people narrate information in a smooth and logical fashion. Increased and ums indicate an increased cognitive load. Since liars need additional time to process information, they typically use and more frequently. I will do my NASA guy impression so you can get an idea of what we're talking about. He'll usually say something like, "Today's spacewalk is taking place 250 miles above the surface of the Earth. And astronauts, I'm a liar and lies a lot, will be conducting their second and third spacewalks respectfully. And as well, we will get started here momentarily. Currently, it is 6:15 a.m. Eastern Time and 5:15 a.m. Central Time in Houston. And the LISS is currently above the center of central China." Sounds something like that. Now we're going to listen to Mr. Silverstein answer a question, and I will actually have a counter on the screen for you to see. Pay attention to the lower right here. We're going to see how many uhs this man can put together in a short 1-minute answer. Enjoy.
With regard to insurance, the World Trade Centers, I was wondering how you can attempt to justify the attacks, the fall of towers and the fall of Building 7 as two separate terrorist incidents as opposed to just one.
Well, there's a court system in America that provides for disputes of this nature, and after protracted litigation, the court settled that half the companies that had signed on to a particular form of policy were only responsible for one event. The other half of the companies who had signed on to another form were responsible for two events. As a result, appeals were taken, and the decisions were finally rendered by the appeals court. It is a done issue at this juncture. I would say easy to justify when you have two planes going to two separate towers at two distinct time frames, bringing the two towers down independently. You can call it anything but two events. And so I will simply tell you what the case got resolved based upon the forms, the specific forms, and what those specific policies held in their language as being controlling one event or two events. And those companies that have been declared to have signed on to one form, to one event policy, were paid one event, and those who signed on to two, paid two. That was it.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that he's a liar. I'm actually trying to say that he's a Zionist piece of garbage and a pathological liar. So make sure you understand what I'm saying. All right, so let's move on to Donald Trump, who has obviously taken quite a turn for the worst here of late. And I now think that we are starting to see exactly what we're getting, which is just going to be more of the same. If you look at some of his picks that are in the Jewish circles, like Stephen Miller, Jason Greenblatt, we've got Bonds Epshelin, Stephen Munchin, David Medina, Michael Glassner, and Louis Eisenberg. And if you don't remember who he is, he was the chairman of the Port Authority for New York and New Jersey in 2001 at the times of the World Trade Center attacks. Then you've got Jared Kushner. Of course, this is Trump's son-in-law and the new appointee as the senior advisor to President Trump. How this isn't a conflict of interest, I'll never know. If you know any of the anti-nepotism laws that were put into place after Kennedy had hired his brother as Attorney General, well, then you see the problem. And it's starting to look like, at least to me, that the whole idea of draining the swamp meant draining the swamp of his business empire into the Washington cesspool. I mean, you've got Jared Kushner, who's got direct ties to Israel, who will have top secret clearance and, access to all that the president has access to. And this, to me, is a huge problem. When you pick somebody who you are saying is best fit for the job, but that person is a member of your family, it creates a conflict of interest. two people of equal positions. Maybe Kushner's allowed to throw his feet up on the desk when another person in that position gets reprimanded for it, as a terrible example, but just kind of explaining where and why we have anti-nepotism laws. He did agree not to take a salary, but what difference does that make? What if you're getting under-the-table money from Mossad to basically sell out all of us goys? I just see a problem with it personally. And then I wanted to look into, what does Trump say about somebody like Larry Silverstein? This would be important to me because the facts are right there. You can look them up. So let's listen to Trump for a little while. Tell us about his good old buddy.
Speaking as an out-of-towner, every time I fly over Manhattan, I see basically an amputated battery area. The bottom of the island looks amputated. I see the missing towers. Is that a better monument than the Freedom Towers just not having anything, or would you rather have the World Trade Towers back?
I'd rather have nothing than what they're building, Chris. It's a terrible design. It was designed by an egghead architect who really doesn't have a lot of experience at designing something like this. And it's just a terrible design. It's wrong angles. I mean, the worst of all, it's a skeletal building. And, you know, if you look at it, what is it really? It's a 60-story building with a skeleton on top of it that goes 40 or 50 stories with nothing in between. And it's a disgusting design that we're going to have to live with for many, many years in New York and actually in the world, because New York City is so international, and it doesn't represent what we want to have represented. What I want to see built is the World Trade Center, stronger and maybe a story taller, and that's what everybody wants. The New York Post came out today strongly. The Wall Street Journal yesterday in their editorial came out strongly for that. That's what people want. They don't want to have, I don't want to be stuck with 5 or 6 buildings that were designed by a guy that shouldn't be designing buildings, in my opinion. And it's just terrible what's happened in New York. And they're trying to push this thing through, and I don't know why. We should have the World Trade Center bigger and better.
Is the problem the architect, Liebeskind, or is it the commission? Did someone tell him to combine a grave marker with an office building, and that's the problem?
Well, I don't even blame the architect. I mean, the architect was in what's called a charrette. A charrette is where the architects get together and they come up with the best design, and they had 5 or 6 firms competing, and they chose his design. So who can blame him? I mean, he came up with this design. He was probably shocked when he got it. But it's a terrible design. And not only the Freedom Tower, the buildings around it, they have roofs at all different angles. It looks like a junkyard, and it shouldn't be built. And instead of not being built, they're pushing forward to get it built faster. And, I mean, frankly, I'd rather see nothing than see that pile of junk.
What role are you going to take? I mean, you're not a sidewalk superintendent. You're Donald Trump. I mean, what role? Will you lead a coalition to stop Governor Pataki from his strong support for the Freedom Tower?
Well, there's not much of a role I can take. It all started when the New York Post called me and asked my opinion. And I'm the biggest developer in New York by far. I've done just about, I guess, everything you can do in the world of real estate. And I see what's happening down there. It's a mess. And the developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon him, Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine. But he didn't want to build this pile of junk. And it's a shame. It's really a shame. We have a great opportunity. And, you know, the terrorists win. If we build this job the way it is, the terrorists win. If we rebuild the World Trade Center, but a story taller and stronger, then we win. I mean, I don't want to have the terrorists win, Chris, and that's what's going to happen if we build this pile of junk.
Let me actually play that one more time. Listen carefully. It should help you make up your mind about Trump. It did for me. Totally different feelings now. How can that man be your friend? Ugh.
The developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon him, Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine. If we rebuild the World Trade Center in the form of a skeleton, Freedom Tower, the terrorists win. We want to rebuild the World Trade Center as the World Trade Center, but better. A little bit taller, a lot stronger, just plain
A lot of people ask, how is it possible that a Boeing plane would be able to destroy or 2 planes would be able to destroy the Twin Towers? Because they were constructed to withstand like a 707 attack.
Well, it's tremendous power and tremendous heat. and people were willing to die, and when they're willing to die and when they're willing to become kamikazes of a sense, there's very little you can do about it. I mean, the heat and the power, actually it was amazing that the initial jolts didn't jar the building as much as people would have thought, but the tremendous amounts of fuel that was dumped on the building and 1,600 degrees temperature, I guess that's probably more than anything could take, no matter what. Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.
Debris. Donald, you're probably the best known builder, particularly of great buildings in the city. There's a great deal of question about whether or not the damage and the ultimate destruction of the buildings was caused by the airplanes, by architectural defect, or possibly by bombs or aftershocks. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it was an architectural defect. You know, the World Trade Center was always known as a very, very strong building. Don't forget, that took a big bomb in the basement. Now, the basement is the most vulnerable place because that's your foundation, and it withstood that. And I got to see that area about 3 or 4 days after it took place because one of my structural engineers actually took me for a tour because he did the building. And I said, I can't believe it. The building was standing solid, and half of the columns were blown out. I mean, so this was an unbelievably powerful building. If you know anything about structure, it was one of the first buildings that was built from the outside. The steel, the reason the World Trade Center had such narrow windows is that in between all the windows you had the steel on the outside. So you had the steel on the outside of the building. That's why when I first looked, and you had big, heavy I-beams, when I first looked at it, I couldn't believe it because there was a hole in the steel. And this is steel that was, you remember the width of the windows in the World Trade Center, folks. I think you know, if you were ever up there, they were quite narrow. And in between was this heavy steel. I said, how could a plane, even a 767 or 747, or whatever it might have been, how could it possibly go through the steel? I happen to think that they had not only a plane, but they had bombs that exploded almost simultaneously, because I just can't imagine anything being able to go through that wall. Most buildings are built with the steel is on the inside around the elevator shaft. This one was built from the outside, which is the strongest structure you can have, and it was almost just like a can of soup.
You know, Donald, we were looking at pictures all morning long of that plane coming into building number 2, and when you see that approach the far side, and then all of a sudden, within a matter of a millisecond, the explosion pops out the other side.
Right. I just think that it was a plane with more than just fuel. I think, obviously, they were very big planes. They were going very rapidly because I was also watching where the plane seemed to be not only going fast, it seemed to be coming down.
I do feel very strongly about the country. I love the country, but I think you're going to have probably George Bush as your next president. He's an excellent guy, an excellent man. He's a friend of mine, and I'm here for that reason.
Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.
I was with George Bush today. I listened to George Bush. I listened to what he said, and I believe very strongly in what he said. I think he is going to be a great president. I'm here because I'm a guest of Vice President Bush, Mrs. Bush, the Mothbachers, and some others. And
as an observer?
As really an observer, and it's an interesting system, and I wanted to see really how the system works. It's the first time that I've been involved in a convention. I came down, I wanted to see how it works, and it's fascinating.
How about financing? Now, what can you give to George? You've already contributed to him, haven't you?
Well, I contributed to him, and I've helped him a little bit, and I guess I'll help him a little bit more, and I'm not sure that he needs anybody's help. I think so far, I really think he's conducted himself brilliantly.
About your acquisition of the boat this summer. The Princess, is that what I call it?
I bought a boat from Adnan Khashoggi, which was formerly called the Nabila.
Nabila.
It's a yacht. And
Adnan Khashoggi, excuse me for a second, is the world's largest arms trader?
I hate to admit it. Actually, it was from the Sultan of Brunei because he was security for a loan and a whole complicated thing. But
now, what are those guys like?
Oh, they're real sweethearts, I have to think. They're real sweethearts.
Are they mean, tough, foreboding guys?
Well, I'd say by nature they're not the nicest guys in the world.
Yeah.
You know, he spent probably $200 million on building this yacht.
We got involved in this Iran-Contra story, which unfortunately backfired a little bit on everybody. They asked me to finance it. I said, okay. So I gave credit to the CIA for $1 million, and they shipped the equipment, and the Iranian paid me back. It was supposed to be a hush-hush operation. As business people, we have ways of manipulating the government officials, and they have ways of manipulating us. I take advantage of opportunities that come. In all relationship in the world, when you have contact, like if I have contact with you now, I will call you when I arrive in New York and say, hi, Adnan, I want to see you. I have to, there's nothing abnormal. You probably will take me out to dinner and introduce me to another person who I make business with.
You would say you're not an arms dealer and you never were?
No. No, the truth is, if you investigate through the records and so on, you find out we never dealt in arms. It was just a title given to us by the press.
But when you helped connect the United States government and the Saudi government over sales of weapons, what would you call that?
Marketing.
I think it's the same kind of conspiracy theorists that you're raising that say, oh, we brought down the World Trade Center ourselves. It turns everything on its head. That's a little silly, I think.
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on a new 9/11 investigation. Did you sign this too?
Yeah, I've got it. Let's see. You bet.
All right, we can get another one. No, no good?
I'm sorry?
I was just wondering what your thoughts are on a new 9/11
I don't have
investigation.
any position for you on that at this
No?
stage.
Will you at some point?
Thank you so much. Haven't heard any compelling reason for a new investigation.
How are you? Very well. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Nice
to meet you too. I have an important piece of information to deliver to you that I've delivered to the majority of the presidential candidates already. It's a group called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. 180 of them, structural engineers, architects around the country, courageous and patriotic, who say there's overwhelming evidence that the three towers in New York were blown up, controlled demolitions on 9/11.
Appreciate your comment, but don't agree.
Have you looked into it?
Absolutely. Every architect I've spoken to, they did timing as to how long they thought it would take to collapse. That's why they put insulation. See those beams up there?
Yeah.
You know why they put insulation there?
Yeah, so that
either for melting and not collapsing.
Right. There were bone fragments found.
If you put jet fuel in this building and burn it at that intensity, it's going to melt.
And it says the process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Was 9/11 your Pearl Harbor?
I think it was the country's Pearl Harbor.
How can you prevent something like this from happening? Because I had heard that some of the foreign press had gotten some warnings that this was going to happen, that there was going to be a catastrophic, devastating event that was going to happen today. But those warnings happened last week, the week before, the week before, the week before. And when somebody comes along with a scenario like this that almost seems like a Hollywood script, how can you prevent something like this?
When the plane flew into one of the two towers, which we saw before our eyes, you thought, well, you know, it's like the graphic artist, isn't it?
Bush was quick to use 9/11 to build up his image. At the same time, he is refusing to cooperate fully with the commission investigating the attacks on America.
Thanks so much, gentlemen. Just a quick note before we move on here. As we take a look of the debris field, we have a lot of correspondents very close into ground zero. I wanted to share with you a fact that really is quite staggering. We have learned that 11.8 metric tons of gold, worth an estimated $110 million, and 30.2 million ounces of silver, valued at $121 million, is buried in the rubble below one of the collapsed buildings of the World Trade Center. And this belongs to people or firms that trade future contracts on the New York Mercantile Exchange. The market's, of course, opening tomorrow. The mayor reiterating he very much wants New Yorkers to get back to their normal lives.
I had been notified that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. At first I thought it was a light aircraft. And my reaction was, man, either the weather was bad or something extraordinary happened to the pilot.
I'd like to ask you about the August 6th PDB.
Sure.
You mentioned it at Fort Hood on Sunday. You pointed out that it did not warn of a hijacking of airplanes to crash into buildings, but that it warned of hijacking to obviously take hostages and to secure the release of extremists being held by the U.S. Did that trigger some specific actions on your part in the administration, since it dealt with potentially hundreds of lives and a blackmail attempt on the United States government?
Yeah. There was also an indication, as you mentioned, that that bin Laden might want to hijack an airplane, but as you said, not to fly into a building, but perhaps to release a person in jail. In other words, you serve it as a blackmail. And of course that concerns me. All those reports concern me. I haven't seen any evidence. I've seen no evidence to date that said this country could have prevented the attack. No, I know. Well, listen, there's all kinds of speculation. As I said, I've seen no evidence that would have led to me to believe that we could have prevented the attacks. And obviously, if we could have, we would have prevented the attacks. Never did in anybody's thought process about how to protect America did we ever think that the evildoers would fly not one, but 4 commercial aircraft into precious U.S. targets.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
$2.3 trillion with a T. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America.
Thought that some foolish soul had gotten lost and made a terrible mistake. I was sitting outside the classroom waiting to go in, and I saw an airplane hit the tower of a TV. You know, the TV was obviously on, and I used to fly myself, and I said, well, there's one terrible pilot. And it said it must have been a horrible accident.
Take the day off. They're blowing up the building. It's terrorist attacks. It's terrorist attacks. Go home. They're blowing up the building.
I was sitting there, and my chief of staff, well, first of all, when we walked in the classroom, I had seen this plane fly into the first building. There was a TV set on, and you know, I thought it was pilot error. And I was amazed anybody could make such a terrible mistake. And you know, something was wrong with the plane, or you know.
I know you said there'll be a time for politics, but you've also said you wanted to change the tone of Washington. Howard Dean recently seemed to muse aloud whether you had advanced knowledge of 9/11. Do you agree or disagree with the RNC that this kind of rhetoric borders on political hate speech?
Yeah. Look, there's time for politics. And, you know, it's time for politics. And it's an absurd insinuation.
The developer is actually a friend of mine, but he didn't want to build this building either. If you look back at the records, I mean, when it was first foisted upon, Larry Silverstein is a great guy. He's a good guy. He's a friend of mine.
So Silverstein's your buddy, huh, Donald? You know what? You fired. The Donald is just Ronald McDonald to me at this point, because his good friend, his good guy buddy, clearly knew about 9/11 a year and a half before. They were designing the Trade Center 7. Then 7 weeks prior, he buys the North and South Tower and immediately doubles their insurance coverage to more than double their worth, changes the policy to a cash-out policy, and then the morning of, he's got a doctor's appointment. His publicist changes his meeting from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m., so he conveniently isn't there, and both kids, independent of each other, not talking to Daddy Silverstein, both are late and both lives are spared. What do you guys think? I call bullshit. Period. But guys, don't trust me. Whatever you do, do your own research. Never listen to somebody and just take what they say as truth. I've done the research that convinces me Donald is just another puppet in a line of many. Maybe he'll be the last in the old system, and we can actually wake enough people to get these clowns on the road again. Be kind to each other. Don't lie to each other. And open your mind. There's truth inside. Till next time, this has been Jeranism.
Peace.
computer model is right. Well, people do this every day, and they call it science. And the people who do it call themselves scientists. I claim they're not doing science at all. They're doing propaganda or publicity or whatever they're doing, but it's not science. It's not playing by the rules of science.
So, thank you very much, Lynn. I hope that that will at least wake up one person to 9/11 truth. Up next, we take a close look at the Zionist, opportunist, lowlife extraordinaire, Larry Silverstein. Here he is with his wife, Kevin.
It's Clara.
Oh, sorry, his wife, Calvin.
No. Clara.
Oh, Larry and his wife, Carson.
No, it's Clara.
Caden?
Clara.
Kurt.
Clara.
Keenan.
Clara.
Kenny. Kane. Chris.
Clara.
Clara?
Yep.
Oh. Okay, Clara.
Mm-hmm.
That's a weird guy's name. Anyway, first let's listen to Larry tell us about the building plans for World Trade Center 7 from the year 2000. Huh?
The building is going to contain not 2 million feet, but 1.7 million. And that's one of the sacrifices we have to make. I said, let's make it and let's get on with it. And so, next thing you know, we've got the designs of a building. And the first design meeting was in April of 2000.
We're not doing science here. We're not doing bad science. We're just not doing science at all, is my claim. What, to me, is most impressive, since I do microscopic work all the time, are the many, many microscopic samples that show these extremely, totally unique red-gray crystals, red and gray in the same crystal, and it was found in all the dust samples. On the other hand, give an argument that's patently false, that no scientist will accept, that fires, office fires, can bring buildings down at the speed roughly of gravity, of free fall. Number one probably of crime investigation is to collect at the scene of the crime as much evidence as possible for what happened. And you had these steel columns in nice even pieces, and they were whisked away, and evidence was destroyed or removed systematically, extremely close to the time that the crime had occurred. This is not only unscientific, it's illegal. So clearly, if you have to lie or deny or ignore evidence, you are not doing science at all. What you're doing is lying, basically. So this is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence. It doesn't fit their preconceived notions. So they ignore the real result, and they misrepresent some and provide evidence from authority that they're commuting on at almost the speed of free fall, which is the gravitational speed. And for two of them, it's because airplanes hit them. And for the third one, it's a mysterious reason. That is, there's no really coherent hypothesis, except it's claimed that there are these fires in them. Now, the most obvious hypothesis for anyone looking at the films, and that was a lot of people, is that the buildings came down because there was very carefully controlled demolition with high explosives that had been planted many weeks, if not months, before. The first thing they do is ignore, in all cases, the most obvious and reasonable hypothesis that is consistent with all other destructions in a very short time of buildings. And what is worse is that all of the evidence was removed. You can't do science without evidence. Very quickly, if this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime, evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. Well, if evidence is removed, no scientist can possibly reconstruct what happened. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. So the claim is that it's something else. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas. So
astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
What's going on, everyone? It's Jaronism, back with another video for you today. I'll admit, I had high hopes for Trump. I felt like maybe he was the answer, that maybe he bucked the system, and F you to the cabal. But then came his cabinet selections and all their connections, and I started to have my doubts. And then came his Zionist connections, especially with Kushner as his top aide, and I was almost done. Then, in research for this video, all hope was lost. So in this video, I have compiled evidence and clips which will be eye-opening to say the very least. Statements by Trump and others about 9/11, about George Bush, about Adnan Khashoggi, World Trade Center towers, and that piece of crap Zionist scumbag who got rich off 9/11, Larry Silverstein. Lots going on, lots of clips. I'll pop in from time to time with a comment, but whether you think 9/11 was an inside job or not, and whether you think Trump is the anti-establishment savior come to save us or just another puppet on a string, and whether you think Larry Silverstein is a nice old man or a demon who eats babies, well, by the end of this video, it will all be very clear. 9/11 was a made-for-TV news media fraud. George Bush is a liar, and a terrible one at that, and Trump is and has been just another pawn in the game. And now, Israel has inside knowledge whenever they want it, thanks to Jared Kushner. And Jared's good buddy, fellow Zionist demon Larry Silverstein, knew exactly what was going on and knew exactly when it was going to happen. So let's start off with a short clip for all those science fans out there who still think 9/11 was exactly as presented. Well, maybe Carl Sagan's first wife and scientist Lynn Margulis can help me get through to you guys. Maybe it takes a scientist who questions something for you to allow yourself to question it as well. So here's Lynn. You might know her as Carl Sagan's first wife. Unfortunately, she is no longer with us. She died in November of 2011. And Kevin Barrett of PressTV.ir said, even more tragically, the most prestigious scientist ever to take up the cause of 9/11 truth, Lynn Margulis, died of a stroke 11/22/11. When I last spoke to Lynn, less than a year before her death, she told me she did not want to speak publicly about 9/11 anymore because politics is too dangerous. She sounded scared, like someone had warned or threatened her. Kevin Barrett. Alright, here's the clip. Remember, this is a scientist telling you guys about 9/11.
I teach at the University of Massachusetts. I have a PhD in genetics, but I really do much more geological things these days. 3 buildings come down.